The human capacity for connection is profound, yet equally profound is the capacity for severance. We observe individuals who, seemingly without warning, systematically dismantle their relational worlds. Friendships dissolve, family ties fray, and intimate partnerships are abruptly terminated. On the surface, such acts can appear baffling, even callous, leaving a trail of hurt and confusion in their wake. Yet beneath the surface of these dramatic departures lies a complex tapestry woven from deep psychological patterns and profound spiritual questions. This phenomenon, which we term radical relational severance, is far more than mere social withdrawal. It is a meticulously constructed defense, a desperate plea, or a misguided quest for freedom, often rooted in a landscape of unaddressed pain and a fundamental misunderstanding of self and interconnectedness. This essay embarks on a comprehensive exploration of the psychology and spirituality of individuals who cut everyone off. We will delve beyond superficial judgments to uncover the intricate psychological mechanisms, from attachment insecurities and trauma responses to identity struggles and cognitive distortions, that compel such drastic actions. Simultaneously, we will illuminate the spiritual dimensions of this experience, drawing wisdom from ancient traditions that speak to the nature of self, suffering, interconnectedness, and the true meaning of liberation. By integrating these seemingly disparate lenses, we aim to offer a more compassionate and holistic understanding of radical relational severance, not as a moral failing, but as a complex human pattern demanding both therapeutic insight and spiritual wisdom. From a psychological perspective, this essay will examine how early developmental experiences, particularly in the realm of attachment, lay the groundwork for later relational patterns. We will explore the nuances of avoidant and disorganized attachment styles, investigating how these internal working models can lead to a pervasive fear of intimacy, a deep-seated distrust of others, and a preference for isolation as a perceived sanctuary. Furthermore, we will delve into the profound impact of trauma, be it developmental, acute, or complex, on the individual's capacity for secure connection. The brain's adaptive responses to threat, including hypervigilance, dissociation, and the fawn response, people-pleasing leading to burnout and eventual withdrawal, often culminate in a desperate need to control one's environment by eliminating perceived sources of pain or entrapment. Cognitive distortions, such as all-or-nothing thinking and catastrophizing, further reinforce the belief that complete isolation is the only safe harbor, while a fragile sense of self may lead to an inability to tolerate the inevitable challenges and demands of interpersonal relationships. Concurrently, the spiritual traditions of the world offer invaluable frameworks for understanding the deeper existential and ontological currents at play. Buddhist teachings on anatta, no self, and dukkha, suffering, provide insight into the impermanence of all phenomena, including relationships, and how attachment to a fixed self or external conditions can lead to dissatisfaction. The act of cutting off may, paradoxically, be a distorted attempt to escape suffering or to assert a false sense of self-sufficiency. Christian contemplative wisdom, particularly concepts like the dark night of the soul and the call to spiritual solitude, offers a nuanced perspective on withdrawal, distinguishing between authentic seeking for divine union and an egoic flight from relational responsibility. Sufi mysticism, with its emphasis on the purification of the nafs, ego-self, and the journey towards fana, annihilation of the separate self, highlights how the ego's defenses can manifest as a desperate clinging to perceived autonomy, ultimately hindering true liberation. Hindu Vedantic philosophy, through the lens of Maya, illusion, and the pursuit of Atman, a Brahman realization, suggests that deep-seated feelings of separation and the illusion of individualistic existence can fuel relational patterns of withdrawal. Existential philosophy, too, contributes to this understanding by exploring themes of authenticity, freedom, responsibility, and the anxiety of confronting one's own aloneness in the face of meaninglessness, which can manifest as a flight from genuine connection. Indigenous wisdom, emphasizing interconnectedness and the sacred web of relationships, provides a stark contrast, highlighting the profound spiritual cost of severing ties with community and the natural world. This essay will unfold in a structured, integrative manner. Following this introduction, Chapter 2 will establish the core psychological and spiritual framework, elaborating on the theoretical underpinnings of radical relational severance. We will dedicate equal attention to detailing the psychological theories, research findings, and neurobiological insights, alongside a comprehensive exploration of the spiritual wisdom from Buddhism, Christian contemplation, Sufism, Hinduism, and existential thought. Chapter 3 will then examine the modern manifestations of this pattern, exploring its prevalence in contemporary society, the role of digital communication, and the unique challenges posed by a culture that often valorizes hyper-individualism. In Chapter 4, we will present a series of brief illustrative examples and composite case studies drawn from both historical spiritual figures and contemporary psychological research to ground our theoretical discussions in relatable human experiences. Chapter 5 will shift to practical integration, offering pathways for healing and transformation through both evidence-based psychological interventions and time-honored spiritual practices, emphasizing how these two domains can mutually reinforce growth. Finally, Chapter 6 will synthesize our findings, offering a contemplative conclusion that transcends simplistic solutions, inviting readers to embrace a deeper understanding of human suffering, connection, and the profound journey towards wholeness. Our ultimate aim is not to pathologize or condemn, but to illuminate, to foster compassion, and to offer tools for both psychological healing and spiritual awakening for those who experience or are impacted by the enigma of severance. In our preceding discourse, we introduced the profound and often perplexing phenomenon of radical relational severance, positing it not as a mere caprice of personality, but as a complex tapestry woven from deep psychological patterns and intricate spiritual questions. We outlined the central enigma to comprehend the multifaceted motivations underpinning such absolute disconnections. Now, we embark upon a more granular exploration, dedicating this chapter to unearthing the psychological frameworks that invariably contribute to and often precipitate the systematic dismantling of interpersonal bonds. We contend that these are not isolated factors, but rather a dynamic, interpenetrating constellation of internal architectures, each reinforcing the others in a cycle that can culminate in profound relational isolation. Central to our psychological understanding is the lens of attachment theory, particularly the manifestations of insecure attachment styles, avoidant and disorganized. A secure attachment cultivated through consistent, responsive caregiving furnishes an individual with an internal working model of self as worthy and others as trustworthy, fostering a capacity for healthy interdependence and resilience in relationship. In stark contrast, individuals exhibiting an avoidant attachment style often develop a profound discomfort with intimacy and emotional vulnerability. Their early experiences may have taught them that expressing needs leads to rejection or engulfment, thus necessitating a strategic deactivation of the attachment system. For such individuals, relationships are perceived as potential threats to autonomy, demanding an emotional self-sufficiency that precludes deep connection. When faced with perceived relational demands, or even the natural ebb and flow of interdependence, the avoidant individual may instinctively withdraw, creating emotional distance. Radical relational severance in this context becomes the ultimate deactivation strategy, a preemptive strike against anticipated engulfment or the perceived burden of emotional obligation, allowing them to retreat into a carefully constructed fortress of self-reliance, albeit one often characterized by an underlying loneliness. Even more complex and often chaotic is the disorganized attachment style, which typically arises from experiences of fear without solution, where the primary caregiver is simultaneously a source of comfort and alarm. This creates an irreconcilable conflict within the child's internal working model, leading to an approach avoidance dynamic. The individual yearns for connection, but is simultaneously terrified by it, perceiving others as unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Their relational patterns are marked by ambivalence, sudden shifts, and a profound difficulty in regulating emotions within relationships. For those with disorganized attachment, radical relational severance can manifest as an abrupt, often bewildering disengagement, a desperate attempt to create safety by eliminating the perceived source of threat, even if that source is a beloved other. The severance is not merely a withdrawal but a chaotic rupture, reflecting the internal fragmentation and the overwhelming inability to reconcile the desire for intimacy with the terror of vulnerability. In both avoidant and disorganized presentations, severance serves as a distorted mechanism for control, an attempt to manage an internal world that feels perpetually threatened by the vicissitudes of human connection. Beyond attachment dynamics, the spectre of trauma responses casts a long shadow over relational patterns, often predisposing individuals to radical severance. Developmental or complex trauma, in particular, can profoundly rewire the nervous system, leading to persistent states of hyperarousal or hypoarousal that dictate how one navigates social landscapes. Hypervigilance. A perpetual state of scanning the environment for threats is a common sequela of trauma. Individuals become exquisitely attuned to subtle cues of disapproval, abandonment, or betrayal, often misinterpreting neutral or even benign interactions as hostile. This constant state of alert can make sustained connection exhausting and terrifying, leading to a preemptive severing of ties as a perceived act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to escape an imagined impending harm. The internal narrative justifies the cut as a necessary defense against a world deemed inherently unsafe. Conversely, dissociation, another potent trauma response, manifests as a detachment from one's own body, emotions, or reality. This psychological mechanism, while protective in moments of overwhelming threat, can render an individual emotionally numb and disconnected from the impact of their actions on others. For those prone to dissociation, the act of severing relationships can occur with a chilling lack of emotional processing, as if detaching from a mere abstraction rather than a living, breathing connection. The profound emotional weight of relational rupture is simply not felt, making the act of disengagement easier, yet simultaneously preventing the necessary grief work and integration that might lead to healthier future connections. A less understood yet equally potent trauma response contributing to severance is fawning. This involves an extreme form of people-pleasing and self-sacrificing, where an individual habitually subjugates their own needs and boundaries to appease others, often to prevent conflict or ensure perceived safety. While seemingly pro-social, this pattern is born of a deep-seated fear of rejection or harm. Over time, the relentless self-abnegation leads to profound burnout, resentment, and a complete erosion of personal boundaries. When the pressure becomes unbearable and the individual feels utterly depleted and exploited, the pendulum can swing violently in the opposite direction. Radical relational severance in this context becomes a desperate, often sudden, act of self-reclamation, a perceived escape from the perceived tyranny of others' expectations, even if those expectations were largely self-imposed through the fawning response. It is a violent assertion of boundaries where none previously existed, a chaotic attempt to restore a sense of self that has been systematically dismantled in the service of others. Compounding these attachment and trauma-informed responses are pervasive cognitive distortions, irrational thought patterns that warp perception and reinforce maladaptive behaviors. All-or-nothing thinking, also known as dichotomous or black and white thinking, is particularly prevalent. Relationships are perceived as either entirely good or entirely bad, people as either wholly virtuous or completely villainous. There is no room for nuance, complexity, or the inherent imperfections of human beings. A single perceived flaw or transgression can instantly transform a formerly cherished connection into something utterly disposable, justifying total rejection. This binary worldview precludes the possibility of conflict resolution, forgiveness, or gradual repair, leading directly to the absolute finality of severance. Catastrophizing further fuels this destructive pattern wherein minor issues are blown out of proportion and the worst possible outcomes are imagined as inevitable. A small disagreement becomes a harbinger of total relational collapse. A minor disappointment is interpreted as definitive proof of betrayal. This exaggerated sense of impending doom provides a powerful, albeit distorted rationale for severing ties, presenting it as a necessary escape from an imagined, catastrophic future. Closely related is lot to mind reading. The assumption that one knows what others are thinking or intending, usually negatively, without any actual evidence. They must be judging me, or they want to control me, are common refrains that preemptively dismantle trust and justify a defensive posture of withdrawal. Finally, emotional reasoning. The belief that something is true simply because one feels it to be true. I feel hurt, therefore they must be trying to hurt me, provides a powerful, self-validating feedback loop. These distortions preclude healthy communication, empathy, and the capacity for perspective taking, trapping individuals in a subjective reality where severance appears to be the only logical recourse. Undergirding many of these psychological architectures is a fragile sense of self. This manifests in several critical ways. One is the lack of object constancy, the inability to maintain a positive emotional connection to someone when they are not physically present or when they have disappointed. For individuals lacking object constancy, a person who is out of sight can quickly become out of mind, or a perceived slight can instantly trigger a complete devaluation of the other, as if all previous positive attributes vanish. This makes relationships highly precarious, as the internal representation of the other is unstable and easily shattered, paving the way for complete relational discarding. Furthermore, a profound identity diffusion, a lack of a stable, coherent and integrated sense of self, can lead individuals to define themselves primarily through their relationships. When these relationships become challenging, overwhelming, or perceived as threatening to this fragile, externally validated identity, severance is often pursued as a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of self, However transient or unstable the self may be, the individual may perceive themselves as needing to shed layers of a false self constructed to please or conform to others in a misguided quest for an elusive true self. However, without the internal resources to cultivate genuine self-knowledge and sustained authentic connection, this quest often leads to a cycle of repeated disconnections, leaving the individual perpetually isolated and adrift. We observe that these psychological factors rarely operate in isolation. Rather, they form an intricate and reinforcing loop. An individual with disorganized attachment might experience hypervigilance, leading them to misinterpret benign cues through catastrophic thinking, which further destabilizes an already fragile sense of self, ultimately culminating in a radical severance. This complex interplay creates a formidable internal landscape where the act of cutting everyone off, while externally appearing baffling or even cruel, is internally experienced as a necessary, albeit painful, act of self-preservation. As we conclude this exploration of the psychological underpinnings of radical relational severance, we reiterate our commitment to a non-judgmental stance. These patterns, while destructive, are often born of deep-seated pain and an earnest, though misguided, attempt to find safety and autonomy. We have begun to unpack the how of severance, laying bare the internal mechanisms. In our subsequent chapter, we will turn our attention to the equally compelling why, delving into the spiritual and existential dimensions that often intertwine with these psychological patterns, offering a more holistic understanding of this profound human experience. While our preceding exploration meticulously delineated the psychological architecture underlying radical relational severance, the intricate dance of the insecure attachment, the visceral echoes of trauma, the distorting lenses of cognition, and the fragile scaffolding of selfhood, we recognize that these frameworks, while profoundly illuminating how such severance manifests, do not fully address the deeper, often unarticulated why. The psychological currents explain the mechanics of the tide, but they may not reveal the unseen lunar pull, the existential gravity, or the spiritual longing that ultimately drives the ocean. Thus, we now turn our gaze towards the profound spiritual and existential dimensions that frequently inform, if not instigate, these profound acts of relational dismantling. We contend that for many individuals engaged in radical relational severance, the act is not merely a psychological defense mechanism, but a misdirected, often desperate, quest for something more fundamental, a perceived authenticity, an imagined freedom from suffering, or a profound redefinition of self and purpose. It is a journey, however convoluted, towards what they believe to be a truer existence, even if that path leads them into profound isolation and misunderstanding. One of the most potent spiritual and existential drivers of severance lies in the fervent search for an authentic self, unburdened by external expectations or relational pressures. In an increasingly complex and interconnected world, the individual may experience the relational sphere as a suffocating web of roles, obligations, and projections, obscuring what they perceive to be their true essence. This quest for authenticity often intertwines with existential angst, a profound unease stemming from the inherent freedom and responsibility of human existence. Faced with the daunting task of self-creation and meaning-making in an indifferent universe, some may interpret relationships as constraints that impede their autonomy, viewing severance as the ultimate act of self-liberation, a radical shedding of all that is deemed inauthentic. They may believe that by excising others, they are excising the parts of themselves that have been moulded or compromised by interaction, hoping to reveal an untouched, pristine core. Yet, as we shall explore, this often becomes a paradoxical endeavour, as the self is, in many traditions, fundamentally relational. Concomitant with the search for authenticity is the deep-seated human desire to escape suffering and meaninglessness. Relationships, by their very nature, invite vulnerability, disappointment, and pain. For those who've experienced significant relational trauma, or who perceive an overwhelming burden of suffering within their connections, severance can appear as the only viable escape route. They may mistakenly equate detachment with peace, believing that by eliminating the sources of relational pain, they will attain a state of serene non-suffering. This pursuit often masks a profound yearning for meaning, where the existing relational tapestry feels devoid of purpose or even actively destructive to their well-being. The act of cutting off then becomes an attempt to impose meaning through absence, to control the narrative of their own suffering by removing its perceived external agents. However, a crucial component of understanding this phenomenon from a spiritual and existential vantage point involves examining the profound misunderstanding of interconnectedness that often underpins such actions. Across diverse spiritual and philosophical traditions, the notion of an isolated, atomized self is largely challenged, if not outright rejected. From the perspective of Buddhism, the concept of anatta, non-self, posits that there is no permanent, unchanging self, and that our sense of individual identity is largely an illusion, arising from the interdependent co-arising of phenomena. Suffering, dukkha, is understood to arise from attachment, craving, and the mistaken belief in a separate, enduring self. While the path to liberation involves non-attachment, radical relational severance often misinterprets this principle. Instead of cultivating a compassionate, wise detachment that recognizes the interconnectedness of all beings while releasing possessive clinging, severance attempts to violently sever the very threads of that interconnectedness. It is an act driven by aversion and fear, not by the equanimity of true non-attachment, which embraces the impermanence of all things, including relationships, without needing to forcefully dismantle them. The individual, in seeking to escape suffering through isolation, paradoxically deepens it by severing themselves from the interdependent web of existence, thereby reinforcing the illusion of a separate self and perpetuating the very attachments they seek to avoid. In Christianity, the emphasis on agape, unconditional love, community and forgiveness stands in stark contrast to relational severance. The teachings consistently highlight our interconnectedness through the body of Christ, the call to love one another as ourselves, and the imperative to bear one another's burdens. Severance in this light can be viewed as a departure from these core tenets, perhaps stemming from a misunderstanding of grace, the transformative power of forgiveness, or an inability to reconcile personal suffering with divine love. While solitude for spiritual reflection is valued, sustained, radical isolation contradicts the call to community and mutual support. The other is often seen as a mirror for our own spiritual journey, an opportunity for practicing compassion, patience, and self-sacrifice. To cut off others is, in essence, to cut off potential avenues for spiritual growth and to reject the very fabric of divine love that binds humanity. Sufism. The mystical dimension of Islam places profound emphasis on the journey towards divine unity, tawhid, through love and the purification of the heart. Relationships, particularly those of profound affection and spiritual mentorship, are seen as reflections of the divine and as essential pathways for spiritual growth. The heart, in Sufi thought, is the locus of spiritual perception and connection. Radical relational severance, therefore, would be understood as a deviation from the path of love and connection, which are vital for unveiling the divine presence within and without. By creating barriers between oneself and others, the individual risks creating more veils that obscure the light of unity rather than dissolving them. True spiritual advancement in this tradition involves expanding one's capacity for love and connection, not contracting it. Hinduism offers a rich tapestry of concepts that speak to interconnectedness. Dharma, righteous conduct, duty; karma, action and its consequences; and the overarching principle of Brahman, the ultimate reality encompassing all existence, underscore the intricate web of relationships. Severance from this perspective might be seen as potentially creating negative karma, disrupting one's dharma, especially in the context of familial or social duties, and hindering one's spiritual evolution. Relationships are not mere external phenomena, but are often understood as karmic connections, providing essential lessons and opportunities for growth and self-realization across lifetimes. To arbitrarily sever these ties without genuine spiritual understanding might be to postpone or complicate necessary karmic lessons, rather than transcend them. The individual, in seeking to escape the challenges of their current relational dharma, may inadvertently create more complex pathways for future learning. From the lens of existentialism, particularly that of thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre or Martin Buber, human existence is fundamentally defined by our freedom, responsibility, and our encounters with the other. While freedom is paramount, it is also a source of anguish, the profound burden of making choices in a world devoid of inherent meaning. Radical relational severance can be interpreted as an extreme exercise of this freedom, an attempt to escape the hell of others' gazes, Sartre, or the demands of authentic I-thou relationships, Buber. However, by severing these connections, the individual risks plunging into an even deeper abyss of isolation and meaninglessness. Authenticity in existential thought is often forged through our engagements and confrontations with the world and with others, not in their absence. Severance, therefore, may lead not to self-creation, but to a profound sense of alienation, where the very canvas upon which meaning could be painted has been deliberately erased. The responsibility for one's choices, including the choice to sever, remains, and the consequences of that choice, often profound loneliness, must be borne. Finally, many traditions of indigenous wisdom universally emphasize the profound interconnectedness of all living things, recognizing humanity as but one strand in a vast, sacred web of life. Community, reciprocal relationships with nature, ancestors, and fellow beings are not just social structures but spiritual imperatives. Radical relational severance from this perspective represents a profound disruption of this sacred interconnectedness, leading to a loss of belonging, spiritual grounding, and a diminished sense of self that is inherently defined by its relationships to the whole. To cut oneself off from one's community, one's family, or even one's land is to sever vital spiritual arteries, leading to spiritual impoverishment and a profound sense of displacement. The wisdom traditions teach that true strength and well-being are found not in isolation, but in harmony and balance within the greater web. It is imperative to note that these spiritual and existential yearnings, while noble in their underlying intent for peace, authenticity, or transcendence, are frequently distorted and misdirected by the very psychological patterns we explored in Chapter 2. An individual with an avoidant attachment style, for instance, might spiritually rationalize their discomfort with intimacy as a quest for true non-attachment, mistakenly equating emotional distance with spiritual wisdom. Cognitive distortions like all-or-nothing thinking can fuel the belief that all relationships are inherently corrupting or burdensome, thus justifying their complete discard in the name of spiritual purity. Trauma responses might manifest as a spiritual seeking of an unconditional connection that human relationships, by their very nature, cannot perfectly provide, leading to disappointment and severance when human limitations inevitably appear. We approach these spiritual and existential dimensions not to judge the individual's journey, but to understand the profound, often unconscious motivations driving their actions. These are not flaws of character, but rather profound, albeit sometimes misguided, human strivings for meaning, liberation, and a deeper understanding of self in the cosmos. By illuminating these interwoven psychological and spiritual threads, we begin to weave a more comprehensive tapestry of understanding, one that acknowledges the deep pain and complex aspirations that propel individuals towards radical relational severance. Having laid bare the intricate psychological mechanisms and the profound spiritual existential undercurrents, our subsequent chapters will delve into the lived consequences of these severances, for the individual, for those left behind, and for the broader social fabric, before charting potential pathways towards healing, integration, and a more compassionate understanding of human connection. While the previous chapter illuminated the profound, if often misguided, spiritual yearnings that can undergird radical relational severance, positing it as a distorted quest for authenticity or liberation, we must now turn our analytical gaze to the inevitable reverberations of such profound disengagement. If the roots of severance are complex, a tangled web of psychological patterns and spiritual misdirection, then its fruits are equally intricate, bearing consequences that ripple outward, touching not only the individual enacting the severance but also those left in its wake, and indeed the very fabric of their respective internal and external worlds. This chapter will meticulously examine these consequences, moving beyond the immediate, often illusory sense of relief to uncover the deeper, more enduring impacts, before laying the foundational stones for the arduous yet profoundly transformative journey of healing. Initially, for the individual embarking upon radical relational severance, there often manifests a potent, almost intoxicating sense of liberation. This nascent phase, akin to the calm after a tempestuous storm, is frequently characterized by a perceived shedding of burdens, a release from the perceived constraints of obligation, expectation, and the intricate dance of human relationship. The individual may experience a fleeting, potent surge of autonomy, a sensation of having finally reclaimed sovereign territory within the self, free from the perceived intrusions and demands of others. This illusory freedom, however, is often a transient phenomenon, a psychological mirage shimmering in the immediate aftermath of rupture, sustained by the very cognitive distortions and trauma responses that precipitated the severance. It is a temporary deactivation of the hypervigilant nervous system, a brief respite from the anxieties of insecure attachment, and a deceptive affirmation of the fragile self's misguided quest for wholeness through isolation. Yet, as the dust settles from these relational earthquakes, the true, often more desolate landscape begins to reveal itself. The long-term consequences for the individual who has systematically dismantled their relational network are frequently paradoxical and deeply distressing. Far from achieving the promised authenticity or spiritual peace, many find themselves adrift in a deepening sea of isolation where the initial sense of freedom transmutes into a profound, often unbearable loneliness. This is not merely the absence of company, but an existential solitude, a gnawing void that arises from the severing of the very connections that provide meaning, purpose, and a sense of belonging in the human experience. The intricate tapestry of shared stories, mutual support and reciprocal care, once dismissed as burdensome, now leaves an aching emptiness, a silent testament to the inherent human need for connection. Psychologically, the absence of relational mirrors can be profoundly detrimental to personal growth and self-understanding. Without the nuanced feedback, the gentle challenges, and the diverse perspectives offered by others, the individual's internal world can become increasingly insular and distorted. Cognitive distortions, previously instrumental in justifying severance, now find fertile ground to proliferate unchecked, reinforcing maladaptive thought patterns and rigid belief systems. All-or-nothing thinking, catastrophizing, and emotional reasoning become entrenched, making it exceedingly difficult to perceive reality with clarity or to cultivate self-compassion. The fragile sense of self, which severance was intended to protect or solidify, often becomes even more precarious, lacking the external validation and varied interactions necessary for robust identity formation. The individual may find themselves trapped in a recursive loop of self-reflection, untempered by external reality, leading to a stagnation of emotional and psychological development. Existing mental health vulnerabilities, such as anxiety, depression, and paranoia, are frequently exacerbated as the vital protective factors of social support and belonging are systematically dismantled. Trust, both in others and crucially in oneself, erodes, leaving behind a pervasive sense of suspicion and a diminished capacity for future connection. Spiritually, the outcome is often equally stark. The quest for non-attachment, for a deeper connection to a transcendent truth unmediated by human relationships, frequently devolves into spiritual stagnation or an acute sense of existential emptiness. While spiritual traditions advocate for a detachment from outcomes, they simultaneously emphasize an active, compassionate engagement with the world and its inhabitants. Severance, by contrast, is an act of disengagement driven by aversion, not by enlightened non-attachment. The individual may feel a profound disconnect from the universal interconnectedness that many spiritual paths highlight, experiencing a void where once they sought unity. The sense of meaning, once sought through liberation from perceived relational suffering, becomes elusive, replaced by a profound lack of purpose in a world where one has consciously chosen to stand apart. The opportunity for spiritual growth through service, compassion, and the challenges inherent in loving relationships is forfeited, leaving the soul in a state of suspended animation, yearning for a connection it has actively rejected. The consequences, however, are not confined to the individual who initiates the severance. For those who are suddenly and often inexplicably cut off, the impact can be devastating, reverberating through their lives with a disorienting force. The others experience a complex tapestry of emotions, profound hurt, bewildering confusion, a sense of betrayal, and often a deep grief akin to bereavement. The sudden withdrawal of a significant relationship, particularly without explanation or closure, can leave individuals questioning their own worthiness, their understanding of the relationship, and even their sanity. This abrupt rupture can erode their trust in others, making them wary of future intimacy and connection. For some, it can trigger secondary trauma, especially if they have prior experiences of abandonment or rejection. The ripple effects can extend to entire family systems, friendship circles, and even professional networks, creating fissures and anxieties within communities that struggle to comprehend the sudden disappearance of a member. The psychological burden placed upon those left behind is significant, often requiring their own processes of healing and meaning-making to navigate the bewildering landscape of sudden loss. Recognizing the multifaceted and often devastating consequences of radical relational severance, both for the individual enacting it and for those impacted, serves as a crucial impetus for exploring pathways toward healing and reintegration. We do not approach this exploration with a punitive gaze, nor with an expectation of simple solutions, but with a profound commitment to compassionate understanding and the belief in humanity's innate capacity for repair and growth. Healing from severance is not about reversing a decision or erasing the past. It is about an evolutionary journey toward greater self-awareness, emotional resilience, and a more authentic, interconnected way of being. It is a process that demands immense courage, self-compassion, and an unwavering commitment to confronting the deeply ingrained patterns that led to the initial ruptures. The journey toward healing is necessarily multifaceted, requiring an integrative approach that addresses the psychological, spiritual, and relational dimensions of the self. We conceptualize this healing as a gradual, intentional process of re-engagement, first with the fragmented aspects of the self, then with the intricate web of human connection, and ultimately with the deeper spiritual currents that animate existence. One of the primary pathways involves psychological reintegration. This entails a courageous excavation of the attachment wounds, trauma responses, and cognitive distortions that form the bedrock of severance. It requires engaging in therapeutic modalities that can help individuals process unresolved trauma, develop secure attachment strategies, and challenge the rigid, often self-defeating thought patterns that perpetuate isolation. Techniques such as EMDR, internal family systems, IFS, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, can be instrumental in fostering self-awareness, regulating emotions, and developing healthier coping mechanisms. The goal is not to eradicate these patterns, but to understand their origins, mitigate their influence, and integrate them into a more cohesive and resilient sense of self. This internal work is foundational, as it addresses the very psychological architecture that made severance seem like the only viable option. Simultaneously, spiritual reconnection becomes an imperative. This is not about returning to dogmatic adherence, but about realigning with the fundamental principles of interconnectedness, compassion, and purpose that many spiritual traditions espouse. It involves a re-evaluation of what true non-attachment entails, not aversion or withdrawal, but a loving engagement with the world free from grasping and expectation. Practices such as mindfulness, meditation, contemplative prayer, and engaging with wisdom traditions can help individuals cultivate a deeper sense of self-awareness, foster empathy, and re-establish a connection to something larger than their isolated self. This spiritual realignment often involves finding meaning not in solitary liberation, but in the mutual care, shared vulnerability, and reciprocal growth that define authentic human and spiritual existence. Furthermore, healing necessitates a gradual and intentional process of rebuilding trust, both internally and externally. For the individual who severed, this means cultivating self-trust by honoring commitments, aligning actions with values, and engaging in self-compassionate practices. Externally, it involves taking measured, vulnerable steps toward re-engagement, understanding that trust is earned incrementally and requires consistent effort and transparency. This is not about immediate reconciliation with all severed relationships, which may not always be possible or healthy, but about developing the capacity for healthy, reciprocal connection. Finally, the development of new relational skills is paramount. Many individuals who engage in radical relational severance lack the robust communication skills, boundary-setting abilities, and capacity for healthy vulnerability necessary to navigate the complexities of human relationships. Therapy and intentional practice can help cultivate these skills, enabling individuals to articulate their needs, manage conflict constructively, and engage in relationships from a place of authenticity rather than fear or avoidance. This includes learning to tolerate discomfort, to sit with vulnerability, and to understand that true intimacy is forged in the space between two whole, yet imperfect, individuals. The journey from severance to healing is undoubtedly arduous, fraught with challenges and requiring profound introspection. Yet, it is a journey that holds the promise of true liberation, not the isolated freedom of absence, but the rich, resonant freedom found in authentic connection, self-acceptance, and a compassionate engagement with the intricate tapestry of life. In the chapters that follow, we will delve more deeply into each of these pathways, offering concrete frameworks and practical approaches for navigating this transformative process, always with the understanding that healing is a unique and deeply personal odyssey, guided by patience, perseverance, and profound self-compassion. The task before us is to illuminate not merely the shadows of severance, but the radiant potential for reintegration and holistic well-being. Having delineated the profound consequences of radical relational severance in the preceding chapter, the initial deceptive solace giving way to the stark realities of loneliness, psychological stagnation, and spiritual emptiness, we now turn our integrative lens toward the intricate and arduous, yet ultimately redemptive pathways to healing and reintegration. This journey, as we understand it, is not a linear progression, but a complex, iterative process demanding profound self-awareness, courageous introspection, and a compassionate re-engagement with both the self and the relational world. It is a testament to the human spirit's inherent capacity for repair and its fundamental yearning for authentic connection, even after profound disengagement. We propose that true liberation from the self-imposed prison of severance necessitates a multifaceted approach that meticulously addresses the psychological wounds, re-establishes spiritual equilibrium, painstakingly rebuilds trust, and cultivates sophisticated relational competencies. This chapter will delve into the methodological frameworks and practical applications for each of these pillars, illuminating how individuals can transition from a state of isolated self-preservation to one of integrated, interdependent flourishing. The initial phase of reintegration invariably involves a deep dive into the psychological substrata that precipitated severance. This requires a dedicated commitment to understanding and transforming the internal landscapes marked by insecure attachment, trauma responses, cognitive distortions, and a fragile sense of self. Trauma-informed approaches. For many who sever ties, the act is a deeply ingrained, albeit maladaptive, trauma response. Healing, therefore, must be trauma-informed, acknowledging that past experiences have shaped neural pathways and behavioral patterns. Therapeutic modalities such as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing (EMDR), somatic experiencing (SE), and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy (TFCBT) are invaluable here. These approaches help individuals process stored traumatic memories, regulate their autonomic nervous system, and develop a more coherent narrative of their experiences. The objective is not merely to recall the past, but to metabolize its emotional residue, thereby reducing hypervigilance, dismantling dissociative barriers, and transforming the impulse to flee or freeze in relational contexts. We observe that as the physiological symptoms of trauma abate, the perceived necessity for radical severance often diminishes, replaced by a nascent capacity for presence and engagement. Reprocessing attachment blueprints. Given the pervasive influence of insecure attachment styles, avoidant, anxious, preoccupied, or disorganized on relational patterns, a significant component of psychological reintegration involves actively reprocessing these early blueprints. This often occurs within the context of a secure therapeutic relationship, which serves as a corrective emotional experience. Through consistent, empathetic, and attuned engagement with a therapist, individuals can begin to internalize a sense of felt safety and relational security. This process, often referred to as earned secure attachment, involves developing a coherent narrative of one's attachment history, understanding its impact, and consciously choosing new relational strategies. Techniques such as attachment-based psychotherapy, emotionally focused therapy, EFT, and psychodynamic therapy can facilitate the exploration of internalized working models of self and others, allowing for the gradual deconstruction of defensive walls built against intimacy and interdependence. The goal is to cultivate an internal sense of security that allows for both autonomy and connection, transcending the false dichotomy that often drives severance. Cognitive restructuring and enhanced self-awareness. The rigid cognitive distortions, all-or-nothing thinking, catastrophizing, mind-reading, that justify and perpetuate severance must be systematically challenged and reframed. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, offer powerful tools for identifying these distorted thought patterns, examining their validity, and replacing them with more balanced, realistic, and compassionate perspectives. This process is profoundly supported by mindfulness practices, which cultivate a non-judgmental awareness of thoughts and emotions, allowing individuals to observe their internal states without being consumed by them. By developing metacognitive awareness, the ability to think about one's thinking, individuals gain agency over their internal narratives, disrupting the automatic cascade of thoughts that previously led to relational withdrawal. This enhanced self-awareness extends to understanding one's own emotional triggers, needs, and boundaries, which is foundational for healthy relational engagement. Consolidating a coherent sense of self. A fragile or diffuse sense of self, often characterized by a lack of object constancy, renders individuals vulnerable to feeling overwhelmed by relational demands or perceived threats. Reintegration necessitates the arduous but essential work of consolidating a stable, resilient, and authentic self-identity. This involves exploring core values, personal strengths, aspirations, and a deeper understanding of one's unique personhood, independent of external validation or relational roles. Self-compassion practices are critical here, fostering a gentle acceptance of imperfections and past mistakes, thereby healing the internal critic that often fuels self-betrayal and the impulse to flee. When individuals develop a robust and integrated sense of self, they are less likely to perceive connection as a threat to their autonomy or identity, paving the way for more authentic and enduring relationships. Beyond the psychological repair, the journey back from radical relational severance inherently involves a profound spiritual reorientation. As we posited earlier, severance often stems from a distorted spiritual yearning, a misguided quest for freedom or authenticity that paradoxically leads to deeper alienation. Spiritual reconnection, therefore, involves realigning with the fundamental truth of interconnectedness and cultivating the universal virtues of compassion, empathy, and love. Mindfulness and contemplative practices. The cultivation of mindfulness through meditation and other contemplative practices serves as a powerful bridge between psychological healing and spiritual awakening. By fostering present moment awareness, individuals can transcend the ego-driven narratives of separation and begin to experience the subtle yet profound reality of interbeing. Practices such as loving-kindness, metta meditation, drawn from Buddhist traditions, specifically cultivate an expansive sense of compassion for oneself, for loved ones, for neutral parties, for difficult individuals, and ultimately for all beings. This systematic training of the heart-mind directly counteracts the isolating effects of severance, fostering an internal environment conducive to empathy and connection. Cultivating compassion and universal love. The spiritual journey back to connection requires an active cultivation of agape, unconditional, selfless love that extends beyond personal preferences or perceived deserts. This involves recognizing the shared humanity in others, even those who have caused pain or with whom relationships have been severed. It is not about condoning harmful behavior, but about understanding the universal suffering that often drives such actions, including one's own. Forgiveness, both of self and others, becomes a pivotal spiritual practice in this phase. It is not an act of condoning, but an act of liberation, releasing the self from the corrosive grip of resentment, anger, and judgment that perpetuates separation. Through engaging with spiritual texts, communities, or practices that emphasize unity, service, and the inherent dignity of all life, individuals can reattune to a sense of purpose larger than their isolated self. This re-engagement with transcendent values often provides a robust framework for understanding the self within a larger, interconnected cosmos, dissolving the illusion of absolute separation. Realigning with purpose and interconnectedness. Many spiritual traditions emphasize the importance of living in alignment with a higher purpose or dharma. For individuals recovering from severance, this often means rediscovering a sense of belonging and contribution that transcends individualistic pursuits. This might involve engaging in acts of service, contributing to a community, or dedicating oneself to a cause that fosters collective well-being. By focusing on outward-flowing generosity and compassion, the inward-turning patterns of isolation begin to dissipate. This realignment helps individuals understand that true freedom is not found in absolute detachment, but in the authentic expression of one's unique gifts within a web of mutual support and shared responsibility. The spiritual emptiness experienced post-severance begins to fill with the profound resonance of belonging and meaning derived from conscious interconnectedness. The culmination of psychological and spiritual healing is the capacity to re-engage relationally, a process that hinges on rebuilding trust both internal and external, and developing the sophisticated skills necessary for healthy, enduring connections. Internal trust as a foundation. Before external trust can be genuinely extended or received, individuals must first re-establish trust in themselves. This means learning to trust one's own judgment, emotions, and intuition, which may have been suppressed or distorted during periods of trauma or relational distress. It involves honoring one's own needs and boundaries, and developing a consistent sense of self-reliability. Healing self-betrayal, the ways in which one may have abandoned oneself in past relationships or through the act of severance, is paramount. As individuals cultivate self-trust, they become less dependent on external validation, more resilient in the face of relational challenges, and better equipped to discern who to trust and how to engage authentically. Navigating external trust with discernment. Rebuilding external trust is a gradual and often cautious endeavor. It requires discerning who to engage with, understanding that not all relationships are meant to be rekindled, and that new relationships must be built on a foundation of mutual respect and clear communication. This process involves taking measured risks, extending vulnerability in small reciprocal steps, and observing how others respond. It is a dance of give and take, where trust is earned through consistent, reliable, and empathetic interactions. For those relationships that were severed, reconciliation, if desired and healthy for all parties, requires immense courage, genuine remorse where appropriate, and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations, acknowledging the hurt caused. The emphasis is on repairing ruptures through accountability, active listening, and a commitment to new relational patterns rather than repeating old ones. Developing sophisticated relational competencies. The journey towards reintegration is incomplete without the acquisition and practice of essential relational skills. Communication. This involves moving beyond passive or aggressive communication to assertive expression of needs, desires, and boundaries. It emphasizes active listening, seeking to understand rather than to simply respond, and practicing empathy and dialogue. Learning to express vulnerability appropriately without overwhelming others or oneself is a key component. Boundaries. Differentiating healthy boundaries from walls is crucial. Healthy boundaries are permeable membranes that protect one's well-being while allowing for connection, whereas walls are rigid structures that prevent authentic intimacy. Individuals learn to identify their limits, communicate them clearly, and enforce them respectfully, thereby fostering relationships built on mutual respect rather than enmeshment or avoidance. Conflict resolution. Relational health is not the absence of conflict, but the capacity to navigate it constructively. This involves developing skills in negotiation, compromise, and empathetic disagreement, understanding that conflict can be an opportunity for deeper understanding and growth, rather than a threat demanding severance. Healthy vulnerability. This involves the courageous act of allowing oneself to be seen, warts and all, within a safe and trusting context. It is the understanding that true connection blossoms not from perfection, but from shared humanity and the willingness to expose one's authentic self, even with its perceived flaws. The path from radical relational severance back to integrated, authentic connection is undoubtedly arduous, requiring unwavering commitment and profound resilience. Yet it is a journey that affirms the inherent human capacity for transformation and the enduring truth that our deepest well-being is inextricably linked to our relationships with others and with the larger tapestry of existence. As individuals navigate these intricate pathways of psychological reintegration, spiritual reconnection, and relational skill building, they discover that true freedom lies not in isolation, but in the courageous embrace of interdependence, compassion, and the profound beauty of shared humanity. This comprehensive approach, acknowledging the interplay of internal and external landscapes, offers a beacon of hope for those who have found themselves adrift in the wake of severance, guiding them towards a horizon of genuine healing and profound belonging. Having meticulously charted the intricate pathways to psychological reintegration, spiritual reconnection, and the rebuilding of relational bridges in our preceding discourse, we now turn our attention to the profound and often arduous journey of actualizing these healing modalities. It is one thing to delineate a theoretical framework for recovery, to sketch the blueprints of a new internal architecture. It is quite another to traverse the labyrinthine corridors of deeply entrenched patterns, where the very mechanisms that once facilitated radical relational severance now manifest as formidable resistance to reconnection. Imagine standing at the mouth of a winding cave, knowing the treasure lies within, but feeling the chilling drafts of past fears emanating from its depths. The journey from isolation to courageous interdependence is not a linear ascent, a smooth climb up a well-marked path, but a cyclical process, replete with moments of profound insight, exhilarating progress that feels like a breakthrough, and inevitable regressions that test the very resolve of the individual, threatening to pull them back into the familiar, albeit painful, solace of their old ways. Each step forward often requires a conscious push against an invisible current of habit and fear. The enduring shadow of past psychological patterns casts a long pall over the nascent attempts at healing, like a persistent cloud obscuring the sun. For those who have cultivated hypervigilance as a primary defense, a constant low-level hum of alertness that scans the environment for any sign of danger, the prospect of genuine vulnerability, the very cornerstone of authentic connection, can trigger an almost unbearable physiological and emotional alarm. The body, accustomed to bracing for perceived threat, interprets invitations to intimacy as harbingers of pain, as if a finely tuned sensor is screaming a warning. "Don't go there," the primitive brain might whisper. "That's where the hurt comes from." This can lead to a resurgence of avoidant tendencies, a sudden urge to withdraw, to create distance, or even the dissociative states that once provided a temporary, albeit ultimately damaging, refuge from overwhelming emotion. The individual might feel their heart race, their breath shorten, a knot forming in their stomach, all in response to a simple gesture of kindness or an invitation for deeper sharing. "This feels too open," a voice inside might protest. "Too risky. I need to get out to protect myself before they can see too much, before they can hurt me again." Similarly, the cognitive distortions of all-or-nothing thinking and catastrophizing, though consciously identified and challenged in therapy, retain a powerful, almost reflexive grip, ready to interpret minor relational friction as irrefutable proof of impending abandonment or betrayal, thereby undermining nascent trust. A late reply to a text, an unintended slight in conversation, a moment of perceived disinterest, each can be amplified into a catastrophic narrative. "They are ghosting me. This always happens. I knew I couldn't trust anyone. It's only a matter of time before everyone leaves." This internal monologue, rapid and relentless, can quickly shatter the fragile sense of connection that has been painstakingly built. The fragile sense of self, perpetually uncertain of its own worth or constancy, struggles to maintain a stable internal representation of others, making object constancy, the ability to hold a positive image of someone even when they disappoint or are absent, a perpetual, often elusive endeavour. The internal landscape becomes a shifting, uncertain terrain, where the solidity of relationships feels constantly precarious. These are not mere intellectual hurdles. They are deeply embodied responses, etched into the neural pathways and somatic memory, requiring sustained, compassionate, and often painstaking work to repattern, to literally reteach the body and mind how to feel safe in connection. The crucible of vulnerability, therefore, becomes the central arena for transformation, a fiery forge where old patterns are melted down and new ones are forged. To rebuild the relational bridge necessitates stepping onto it, taking that terrifying first step into the unknown, and for those accustomed to its demolition, to retreating or destroying connections at the first sign of trouble. This act demands an extraordinary measure of courage. It involves relearning how to tolerate the inherent discomfort of not knowing what the outcome will be, of relinquishing absolute control over how others perceive or respond, and of allowing oneself to be seen, warts and all, with all the imperfections and fears that have been so carefully hidden. "What if they judge me?" the inner voice screams. What if they recoil? What if this vulnerability is just another weapon for them to use against me? Yet to heal, one must face these fears. This is where the secure therapeutic relationship discussed in Chapter 5 serves as a vital proving ground, a safe harbour where the individual can tentatively practice new ways of relating, where ruptures in understanding can be repaired, and where the self can experience being held and understood without judgment. The therapist, through consistent attunement and unwavering presence, models the very relational security that was often absent in early life, providing a corrective emotional experience that gradually, incrementally, rewires the internal working models of attachment. A simple exchange might illustrate this. I felt so much shame telling you that, the client might confess, eyes downcast. The therapist, meeting their gaze with gentle warmth, might respond, "Thank you for trusting me with that. It takes incredible strength to share such a vulnerable part of yourself, and I see your courage." This consistent, non-judgmental acceptance begins to quiet the inner critic. Yet even with such dedicated support, the path is fraught with challenges. Moments of perceived rejection, miscommunication, or the inevitable friction inherent in human interaction can easily trigger the old, well-worn pathways of severance. A friend's forgotten call, a partner's distracted gaze, a colleague's brusque email. Any of these can, for the hypervigilant self, feel like a direct assault, a confirmation of worthlessness. Here, self-compassion, not self-condemnation, becomes paramount. Instead of spiraling into self-blame, "I messed up again. I knew I wasn't good enough for this connection." We recognize that setbacks are not failures but opportunity for deeper understanding and integration. They are invitations to pause, to inquire into the resurfacing fears with curiosity rather than judgment, and to apply the very tools of mindfulness and cognitive restructuring that have been cultivated. The capacity to acknowledge the pain, to soothe the inner critic, perhaps by internally saying, "Whoa, this hurts and it's okay to feel this. I'm not abandoning myself now." And to recommit to the journey, rather than retreating into the familiar solace of isolation, marks a profound shift from reactive severance to conscious, resilient engagement. This iterative process of engagement, withdrawal for self-reflection, compassionate inquiry and courageous re-engagement, is crucial for consolidating new relational competencies and strengthening the emerging, more integrated sense of self. Beyond the individual therapeutic journey, we must also consider the broader relational ecosystem within which healing unfolds. While individual work is foundational, genuine and sustainable reconnection ultimately requires a supportive external environment. This necessitates a profound shift not only within the individual, but also, at times, within the others who were impacted by the initial severance. For those who experience the abrupt withdrawal of a loved one, their own hurt, confusion, and sense of betrayal are legitimate and must be acknowledged, given voice and processed. Healing in this broader context may involve difficult conversations laden with unspoken grievances and raw emotions, the setting of healthy boundaries by all parties to protect their newfound vulnerabilities, and a mutual commitment to understanding and, where appropriate, forgiveness. It is a nuanced dance, requiring immense patience, profound empathy, and a willingness to engage in the delicate, often uncomfortable work of repairing trust, which, once shattered, is not easily restored. A spouse might say with a tremor in their voice, "When you pulled away, I felt like I'd been erased. I need to know that won't happen again." The individual on the healing path must then find the courage to respond, not defensively, but with genuine acknowledgement of the pain they caused. This is not to place the burden of healing solely on those who are cut off, but to acknowledge that the relational field itself requires tending, a collective effort to cultivate fertile ground for reconnection. Furthermore, we contend that a more comprehensive societal understanding of the dynamics of radical relational severance is imperative. If we are to move beyond reactive responses to this phenomenon, merely shaming or pathologizing those who withdraw, and towards proactive prevention, we must cultivate greater relational intelligence within our communities and institutions. This involves fostering environments that prioritize secure attachment in early childhood, recognizing its foundational role in healthy development, promoting emotional literacy and regulation skills throughout the lifespan, from grade school to adult education, and equipping individuals with robust tools for constructive conflict resolution and assertive communication. Educational initiatives, community dialogues that normalize discussions about mental health and relational struggles, and accessible mental health resources can all contribute to a cultural milieu where the complex interplay of psychological patterns and spiritual yearnings is better understood, and where individuals feel supported in addressing their internal struggles before they escalate into patterns of extreme withdrawal. Imagine schools teaching empathy as rigorously as mathematics, or workplaces offering workshops on active listening and boundary setting. A society that values authentic connection and provides pathways for its cultivation may, in turn, significantly reduce the impetus for individuals to seek an illusory freedom in isolation, recognizing that true liberation lies elsewhere. The ultimate vision emerging from this comprehensive exploration is one of courageous interdependence. This is not a return to enmeshment or a naive idealization of human connection, but rather a mature understanding that true liberation and profound well-being are found not in the absence of others, but in the quality of our engagement with them. It is the realization that our individual flourishing is inextricably linked to the flourishing of the collective, and that the deepest spiritual yearnings for authenticity and freedom are most fully realized within the crucible of relationship. The self, once fragmented by trauma or made fragile by perceived inadequacy, finds its coherence and strength not in rigid autonomy, a fortress built against the world, but in the dynamic interplay of connection and healthy differentiation. It is a self that understands its boundaries while simultaneously recognizing its inherent interconnectedness, capable of both deep intimacy and respectful solitude. In reconciling the paradoxes inherent in the human condition, the innate drive for autonomy alongside the fundamental need for belonging, we arrive at a profound insight. The quest for an authentic self, often misguidedly pursued through severance, ultimately finds its truest expression in the courageous act of offering one's whole self to the world, flaws and all, within a web of conscious, compassionate relationships. This is the journey from perceived safety and isolation to the profound security found in genuine, albeit imperfect, connection. Our intent throughout this inquiry has been to illuminate, not to condemn, to understand, not to pathologize, and to offer a framework for healing that honors the complexity of the human spirit. It is a call for profound empathy, for diligent self-reflection that looks inward without judgment, and for a collective commitment to fostering a world where no one feels compelled to dismantle their relational tapestry in a desperate search for peace. The work of integration, psychological, spiritual, and relational, is an ongoing invitation to embody our fullest, most interconnected humanity. Having navigated the intricate theoretical landscapes of severance, its psychological underpinnings, spiritual yearning, systemic consequences, and the challenging pathways to healing, we now turn our focus to the profound and arduous process of actualizing courageous interdependence. The vision articulated in our preceding discourse, while compelling, remains an abstract ideal until it is meticulously embodied within the lived experience of the individual who has historically resorted to radical relational severance. This chapter endeavours to delineate the practical, iterative, and often circuitous journey from the analytical understanding of healing to its felt realization, exploring the granular steps, the inevitable resistances, and the transformative breakthroughs that characterize a genuine return to authentic, interconnected being. The initial and perhaps most formidable undertaking in this actualization process resides within the internal landscape, the forging of an internal secure base. For individuals whose relational histories have been marked by inconsistency, betrayal, or profound neglect, the external world has often been perceived as inherently unsafe, a crucible of potential harm from which severance offered a desperate, albeit ultimately self-defeating escape. Consequently, the first order of business is not immediately to re-engage with others, but to cultivate an unwavering sense of safety and worth within oneself. This involves a sustained and often painful engagement with self-compassion, an antidote to the corrosive self-judgment and shame that frequently undergird the impulse to withdraw. We observe that the practice of self-compassion, moving beyond mere intellectual assent to a visceral experience of kindness towards one's own suffering, is pivotal. It requires a deliberate redirection of the self-critical gaze, replacing it with an understanding that past relational patterns, however maladaptive, were often born of an attempt to survive. This internal secure base is further fortified through the diligent integration of fragmented aspects of the self. The individual who severs often operates from a dissociative stance, where past wounds and present anxieties are compartmentalized or projected, preventing the formation of a coherent and resilient identity. Through trauma-informed therapeutic modalities and introspective practices, the task becomes one of acknowledging these disparate parts, the wounded child, the hypervigilant protector, the longing for connection, and weaving them into a unified narrative. This process, often facilitated by mindfulness and contemplative practices, allows for the development of an inner witness that can observe emotional states without being overwhelmed by them, thereby fostering a sense of internal stability that lessens the desperate need for external control or escape. When an individual feels securely anchored within themselves, the perceived threats of intimacy diminish, and the capacity for regulated emotional responsiveness expands, laying the groundwork for external relational re-engagement. However, the internal shift, while foundational, is merely the prelude to the delicate art of relational re-entry. The chasm between theoretical understanding and practical application is vast, particularly for those whose neural pathways have been deeply grooved by patterns of withdrawal and defense. The prospect of re-engaging with the relational world, even with a newly cultivated internal secure base, can evoke profound task and terror, triggering dormant fears of abandonment, engulfment, or re-traumatization. We posit that this re-entry is an iterative process, characterized by small intentional steps, often fraught with setbacks and requiring immense courage. The initial forays into relational re-engagement often involve the careful selection of corrective emotional experiences. These are interactions, often within a therapeutic context or with carefully chosen trusted individuals, that directly contradict the individual's internalized negative relational schemas. For instance, if an individual expects judgment upon expressing vulnerability, a corrective experience might involve being met with empathy and acceptance. If they anticipate abandonment when asserting a boundary, a corrective experience would be for that boundary to be respected. These moments, however small, begin to recalibrate the nervous system, gradually shifting the implicit belief that relationships are inherently dangerous or unreliable. Crucial to this re-entry is the practical application of the relational competencies outlined in Chapter 5. Authentic communication, for example, transcends mere verbal exchange. It involves learning to articulate one's internal experience, needs, desires, fears, boundaries with clarity and integrity, even when the internal resistance is overwhelming. This is a radical departure from the passive-aggressive communication, avoidance, or sudden explosive ruptures that often precede severance. Similarly, navigating conflict transforms from a perceived threat to an opportunity for deeper connection. Instead of viewing disagreements as precursors to rupture, the individual learns to engage with differing perspectives as natural components of human interaction, utilizing skills of active listening, empathetic validation, and collaborative problem-solving. This shift requires a fundamental reframing of conflict from a destructive force to a potentially constructive one, a crucible for relational growth rather than an inevitable pathway to isolation. Furthermore, the individual must learn the nuanced dance of proximity and distance, the ability to regulate intimacy in a healthy, reciprocal manner. This involves discerning when to lean into connection and when to assert a need for space, not as a means of escape, but as a healthy boundary. For those prone to severance, the pendulum often swings between overwhelming enmeshment and abrupt detachment. The goal is to find a dynamic equilibrium, a rhythm of connection and autonomy that honors both individual integrity and relational interdependence. Underpinning and facilitating this delicate re-entry is the indispensable role of the safe harbor, a consistent, reliable, and non-judgmental relational container. While internal work is paramount, the journey out of relational isolation is rarely, if ever, a solitary one. The therapeutic alliance often serves as the primary safe harbor, offering a microcosm of secure attachment where new relational patterns can be explored, practiced, and integrated. Within this unique relationship, the individual can experiment with vulnerability, test boundaries, and experience consistent attunement, thereby internalizing a model of healthy relating. Beyond the therapeutic sphere, the gradual integration into supportive communities, be they spiritual, interest-based, or peer support groups, provides further opportunities for belonging and connection. These communities offer a sense of being witnessed and held, allowing the individual to experience acceptance without the prerequisite of perfection or the fear of being overwhelmed. The cultivation of a diverse relational ecology, comprising different levels of intimacy and commitment, acts as a buffer against the devastating impact of any single relational challenge, thereby reducing the perceived need for total severance. It is within these safe relational contexts that the crucible of vulnerability previously discussed can truly transform fear into courageous engagement. Ultimately, the aim extends beyond mere restoration. It is about cultivating a new relational ecology for the self. This involves a conscious and ongoing commitment to shaping a life where interdependence is not just tolerated, but actively embraced as a source of strength, meaning, and joy. It is a shift from a reactive, defensive stance to a proactive, intentional engagement with the world. This new ecology is characterized by reciprocity, where giving and receiving are in dynamic balance, by empathy, where the experience of the other is genuinely considered, and by active listening, where presence and understanding take precedence over judgment or self-preoccupation. This conscious cultivation acknowledges that true liberation is not freedom from connection, but freedom within connection. It is the capacity to engage authentically, to experience the full spectrum of human emotions within relationships, joy, sorrow, frustration, love, without defaulting to the protective mechanism of severance. It implies a robust sense of self that can withstand the inevitable frictions and complexities of human interaction, viewing them as opportunities for growth rather than insurmountable obstacles. The individual learns that their identity is not diminished by connection, but rather enriched and expanded through it, mirroring the profound spiritual truth of universal interconnectedness. The journey towards courageous interdependence is an ongoing odyssey, not a finite destination. Setbacks are not merely possible, they are inevitable. Old patterns deeply etched into the psyche can resurface under stress, triggering familiar impulses to withdraw or sever. Therefore, sustaining growth and resilience requires continuous self-monitoring, a commitment to ongoing learning, and the adaptive capacity to refine strategies when challenges arise. It demands a persistent willingness to engage with discomfort, to practice self-forgiveness when one falters, and to repeatedly choose connection over isolation, even when the latter feels like the path of least resistance. In essence, Chapter 7 underscores that the theoretical frameworks and challenges previously outlined find their ultimate meaning in their practical application. It is in the day-to-day, moment-to-moment choices, to lean into discomfort, to communicate authentically, to seek out safe connection, to practice self-compassion, that the profound transformation from radical relational severance to courageous interdependence occurs. This arduous yet deeply rewarding path illuminates the extraordinary human capacity for change, for healing, and for the profound beauty found in choosing to participate fully in the intricate, messy, and ultimately sacred tapestry of human connection. The individual, once isolated by their own protective mechanisms, discovers that their true strength, their most profound freedom, and their deepest sense of self are not found in the absence of others, but in the vibrant, compassionate, and resilient embrace of an interconnected world. Having navigated the intricate pathways of individual healing and the delicate art of relational re-entry, we now turn our gaze outward, beyond the immediate crucible of personal transformation, to consider the broader implications of courageous interdependence. The odyssey of healing from radical relational severance is not merely an isolated journey. It is a profound testament to the human capacity for growth, a resonant chord that, when struck, vibrates through the intricate tapestry of the collective existence. The individual's arduous ascent towards connection, characterized by the forging of an internal secure base and the cultivation of a new relational ecology, invariably casts ripples that extend far beyond their personal sphere, touching families, communities, and ultimately the very fabric of society. The reclamation of a self previously fragmented by the perceived necessity of severance represents a vital contribution to the collective well-being. When an individual chooses to lean into the discomfort of vulnerability, to engage with the nuanced dance of proximity and distance, and to embrace the inherent messiness of human connection, they are not only healing themselves, they are also modeling a different way of being. This courage, often born from profound pain, becomes a beacon, subtly challenging the prevailing narratives of hyper-individualism and self-sufficiency that can inadvertently foster the very conditions for relational rupture. We contend that the act of choosing interdependence, after having known the depth of isolation, is an act of profound social consequence, demonstrating that true strength lies not in imperviousness, but in the resilient capacity for authentic engagement. Yet, to truly cultivate a society where radical relational severance becomes a less frequent, less devastating phenomenon, we must transcend the reactive paradigm of individual healing and embrace a proactive commitment to fostering relational intelligence at a systemic level. The new relational ecology that an individual strives to build must find fertile ground within a larger societal ecosystem that values and supports genuine connection. This necessitates a fundamental shift in our collective understanding of human nature, moving away from a fragmented view of autonomous selves towards an integrated recognition of our inherent interconnectedness, a concept deeply embedded in many spiritual traditions, yet often overlooked in our modern, atomized societies. This shift begins with the intentional cultivation of relational literacy from the earliest stages of development. Just as we prioritize cognitive and emotional intelligence, we must equally invest in equipping individuals with the skills, frameworks, and cultural narratives necessary to navigate the complexities of human relationships with wisdom and compassion. This includes 1. Early childhood education in attachment and empathy, integrating foundational principles of secure attachment, emotional regulation, and perspective-taking into early educational curricula. Children who learn to identify and articulate their needs, understand the feelings of others, and experience consistent responsive caregiving are less likely to develop the insecure attachment patterns that often precede severance. 2. Adolescent development of relational competencies. Providing adolescents with explicit instruction and practice in authentic communication, boundary setting, constructive conflict resolution, and healthy vulnerability. This involves moving beyond superficial social interactions to foster deeper understanding of relational dynamics, the impact of one's actions on others, and the development of a resilient, connected sense of self. 3. Challenging hyper-individualistic narratives. Critically examining and reframing cultural stories that glorify absolute independence, emotional stoicism, and the pursuit of individual success at the expense of relational well-being. We must champion narratives that celebrate interdependence, mutual support, and the profound enrichment that arises from diverse, robust relational networks. This involves showcasing examples of courageous interdependence across various domains of life, from families and friendships to professional collaborations and community building. 4. Promoting relational hygiene in adulthood. Encouraging ongoing learning and development in relational skills throughout the lifespan. This could manifest in accessible community workshops on communication, conflict mediation, and mindful relating, as well as destigmatizing and normalizing seeking relational support, whether through therapy, coaching, or peer groups. Just as we attend to physical and mental hygiene, so too must we consciously maintain our relational health. Furthermore, a truly supportive relational ecosystem requires robust community infrastructure that actively counteracts the forces of isolation and fragmentation. This involves creating safe harbors beyond the therapeutic space, expanding access to community-based initiatives that foster belonging, mutual aid, and shared purpose. These could include intentional communities, intergenerational programs, volunteer networks, and culturally relevant support groups that provide opportunities for genuine connection and reciprocal care, offering alternative points of entry for those wary of traditional therapeutic settings. Workplace cultures that prioritize relational well-being, moving beyond purely transactional models of work to cultivate environments that value psychological safety, collaborative communication, and supportive collegial relationships. Burnout, often a precursor to relational retreat, can be mitigated by fostering cultures that recognize the human need for connection and shared endeavor. Addressing systemic inequalities. Recognizing that socioeconomic disparities, systemic discrimination, and lack of access to resources can profoundly impact an individual's capacity to form and maintain healthy relationships. A society committed to relational well-being must also be committed to justice and equity, ensuring that all individuals have the foundational support necessary to thrive relationally. The journey of healing from radical relational severance is, as we have often asserted, an odyssey, a continuous process rather than a fixed destination. For individuals who have walked this path, the work of maintaining courageous interdependence remains an ongoing practice of self-awareness, relational discernment, and conscious choice. Setbacks, moments of doubt, and the persistent whisper of old patterns are inevitable. A compassionate relational ecosystem, therefore, understands and anticipates these challenges, offering sustained support rather than expecting a linear, uncomplicated trajectory. This means normalizing imperfection and repair. Shifting from a culture that demands flawless relational performance to one that embraces the inevitability of rupture and the profound possibility of repair. Learning to apologize authentically, to forgive, and to rebuild trust after missteps are crucial skills that must be celebrated and taught. Cultivating a culture of grace, extending grace not only to those who have experienced severance, but also to those impacted by it. Understanding that the journey is complex for all involved, and that healing often requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to hold space for multiple perspectives and pains. Embracing the wisdom of relational cycles. Recognizing that relationships, like all living systems, evolve through cycles of closeness and distance, growth and stagnation, challenge and renewal. A mature relational intelligence understands that periods of individual introspection, or even temporary withdrawal, when communicated and contained, can be healthy components of a larger, robust connection, distinct from radical severance. Ultimately, our exploration of the psychology of people who cut everyone off culminates in a vision of a world where the human impulse for connection is honored, nurtured, and skillfully navigated. It is a vision where the deep spiritual yearning for authenticity and freedom is understood to be intrinsically linked to, rather than separate from, the tapestry of interconnectedness. When individuals are supported in understanding their own inner landscapes, their attachment patterns, trauma responses, cognitive distortions, and the fragile sense of self that can drive them to such desperate measures, and when society provides the fertile ground for them to heal and grow, the perceived necessity of radical relational severance diminishes. This is not a utopian fantasy, but a pragmatic call to action. The costs of relational fragmentation, in terms of individual suffering, societal discord, and the erosion of collective trust, are profound and undeniable. By contrast, the dividends of courageous interdependence are immeasurable. Resilient individuals, thriving communities, and a more compassionate, understanding world. The work begins within each of us, in the quiet courage to face our own vulnerabilities and to extend ourselves towards others. It expands outward, through our families and friendships, into our communities, and ultimately into the shaping of cultural narratives and systemic supports. We conclude this discourse not with definitive answers, for the human heart and its intricate relational dance remain an eternal mystery, but with an invitation to lean into the discomfort of connection, to embrace the inherent interdependence of our existence, and to participate in the ongoing, courageous work of building a world where no one feels compelled to cut themselves off from the essential lifeblood of human belonging. For in the finer analysis, our truest liberation is found not in severing ties, but in the profound and enduring strength of our shared humanity. This odyssey of understanding, we hope, serves as a compass, guiding us all towards a more deeply connected and compassionately lived future. We have journeyed through the labyrinthine corridors of radical relational severance, dissecting its psychological roots, exploring its existential motivations, and charting its profound repercussions. From the intricate dance of insecure attachment and trauma responses to the spiritual yearning for an elusive authenticity, we have endeavoured to illuminate the multifaceted origins of this deeply human, albeit often self-defeating pattern. Our exploration has traversed the desolate landscapes of isolation and the arduous, yet redemptive pathways to healing, culminating in a societal imperative to foster relational intelligence. Now, as we draw this inquiry towards its synthesis, we turn our gaze to the active construction of a future where courageous interdependence is not merely an aspirational ideal, but the foundational architecture of human flourishing. The preceding chapters have meticulously laid bare the intricate interplay between individual psychodynamics and broader societal currents. We recognize that the propensity for radical relational severance, while manifesting as a deeply personal act, is simultaneously a symptom of, and a contributor to, a culture that often valorizes hyper-individualism and misinterprets autonomy as absolute independence. Our task, therefore, extends beyond mere understanding. It compels us towards active engagement with the principles that underpin genuine connection and collective well-being. This requires a conscious and sustained commitment to cultivating what we term interbeing, a profound recognition of our intrinsic, inseparable connection to all life, a concept echoed across diverse wisdom traditions. Cultivating interbeing necessitates a dual focus: the meticulous tending of the inner landscape and the proactive shaping of our external relational ecosystems. Individually, this means internalizing the lessons gleaned from the pathways to healing, the diligent work of trauma integration, the reprocessing of attachment wounds, the dismantling of cognitive distortions, and the consolidation of a coherent, resilient self. It entails the ongoing development of an inner secure base, a psychological anchor forged from self-compassion, self-awareness, and an unwavering commitment to one's own growth. This internal fortitude is not a prelude to isolation, but rather the essential wellspring from which authentic, vulnerable, and enduring connections can spring. Without this secure foundation, attempts at external connection often become fraught with the very insecurities and fears that precipitate severance. We must first learn to be a safe harbour for ourselves before we can truly offer or receive safe harbour from others. Furthermore, the cultivation of interbeing demands a sophisticated refinement of relational competencies. Beyond the foundational skills of communication and boundary setting, we speak of a deeper attunement, an empathic resonance that allows us to perceive the nuanced emotional landscapes of others without merging or losing ourselves. This involves the courageous practice of active listening, not merely to respond, but to genuinely understand, the discernment to offer compassionate presence without attempting to fix, and the humility to acknowledge our own limitations and blind spots within the relational dynamic. It is in this crucible of mutual vulnerability and respectful engagement that trust is not just rebuilt, but fundamentally reimagined as a dynamic, co-created field of shared experience. On a societal level, the call for relational intelligence articulated in Chapter 8 translates into concrete, actionable frameworks. It necessitates a systemic re-evaluation of educational paradigms, moving beyond purely cognitive development to integrate socio-emotional learning as a core curriculum from early childhood. Imagine educational environments where conflict resolution is taught with the same rigor as mathematics, where empathy is practiced through structured exercises, and where the ethics of interconnectedness are explored with the depth typically reserved for philosophy. Such a pedagogical shift would equip future generations with the foundational tools to navigate the complexities of human relationships with grace and resilience, thereby preemptively mitigating many of the drivers of relational fragmentation. Moreover, fostering a culture of interbeing requires a deliberate deconstruction of narratives that glorify self-sufficiency to the exclusion of mutual support. Media, popular culture, and even economic rhetoric often inadvertently reinforce the myth of the lone achiever, subtly undermining the inherent value of collective endeavour and communal responsibility. We must actively champion stories and models that celebrate collaboration, highlight the strength found in diversity, and demonstrate the profound enrichment that arises from synergistic relationships. This involves challenging the subtle biases embedded in our language and thought patterns that elevate competition over cooperation and individual gain over shared prosperity. The journey towards a relationally intelligent future is, however, not without its formidable challenges. The deeply ingrained patterns that give rise to severance, the reflexive withdrawal, the protective walls, the fear of engulfment or abandonment, represent powerful inertial forces. Overcoming these requires not only conscious effort, but also a profound commitment to self-reflection and a willingness to sit with discomfort. The process of dismantling old defenses and constructing new pathways of connection is often arduous, marked by moments of doubt, relapse, and profound vulnerability. We must cultivate collective patience and compassion for this ongoing human endeavour, recognizing that transformation is a gradual unfolding, not an instantaneous revelation. Indeed, the very act of embracing courageous interdependence can initially feel counterintuitive, especially for those whose past experiences have taught them that connection leads to pain. Here, the spiritual dimensions of our inquiry become particularly salient. Reconnecting with a sense of universal interconnectedness, whether through contemplative practices, engagement with nature, or service to others, can provide a powerful antidote to the isolating narratives of the ego. It offers a broader context for understanding personal suffering and a deeper wellspring of resilience and meaning. When we perceive ourselves as integral threads in the vast tapestry of existence, the impulse to sever becomes less compelling, replaced by a desire to mend, to weave, and to strengthen the collective fabric. The architecture of interbeing, therefore, is not a static blueprint, but a living, evolving framework that we continually construct and refine. It requires an ongoing commitment to ethical relationality, a conscious choice to engage with others from a place of integrity, respect, and genuine care. This means embracing responsibility for our impact on others, acknowledging our shared humanity, and actively working to repair ruptures rather than abandoning relationships at the first sign of difficulty. It means understanding that true strength lies not in invulnerability, but in the capacity to be authentically vulnerable, to seek repair, and to extend forgiveness, both to ourselves and to others. Ultimately, our exploration of radical relational severance reveals a profound truth. The human spirit yearns for connection, even when its outward manifestations appear to reject it. The act of cutting others off, though seemingly an assertion of control or freedom, often betrays a deeper unaddressed wound, a desperate attempt to protect a fragile self from perceived harm. Our collective endeavour, then, is to transform this defensive impulse into a conscious, courageous embrace of our inherent relationality. It is to build a world where the foundations of trust are strong enough to weather storms, where empathy is a practiced art, and where every individual is recognized as an indispensable part of a greater whole. This vision of a relationally intelligent future is not a utopian fantasy, but an achievable reality, predicated on the deliberate choices we make, both individually and collectively in the present moment. It is in the everyday acts of kindness, the courageous conversations, the willingness to remain present even when uncomfortable, and the steadfast commitment to repair and growth that we begin to dismantle the walls of isolation and construct the enduring bridges of connection. We conclude this chapter not with a definitive end, but with a renewed call to action, to cultivate our inner landscapes, to consciously shape our relational ecosystems, and to dedicate ourselves to the profound and sacred work of weaving a more interconnected, compassionate and resilient human tapestry. The journey of interbeing is the journey of humanity itself, and its successful navigation depends on our collective will to choose connection over severance, healing over fragmentation, and shared flourishing over isolated survival. Having articulated the profound societal imperative to foster relational intelligence, culminating in the vision of interbeing, a radical recognition of our intrinsic connection to all life, we now turn our gaze to the arduous yet essential journey of actualizing this collective transformation. This is not merely an abstract philosophical ideal, nor a utopian fantasy, but a deeply practical and urgent call to re-engineer the very fabric of our shared existence, moving from the pathology of fragmentation to the health of holistic interdependence. The concept of interbeing, as we posit it, transcends the simplistic notion of mere connection or social networking. It is an ontological assertion, a fundamental truth about the nature of reality, wherein no entity exists in isolation, but rather emerges from and is sustained by a vast web of reciprocal relationships. Drawing from the Buddhist concept of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, or the indigenous understanding of all beings as relations, interbeing posits that the individual self is not a discrete atomistic unit, but a nodal point within an infinitely complex dynamic system. Our individual flourishing, therefore, is inextricably linked to the flourishing of the collective, and indeed to the health of the entire planetary ecosystem. This understanding stands in stark contrast to the pervasive hyper-individualistic narratives that have long dominated Western thought, often fostering an illusion of self-sufficiency that, paradoxically, renders individuals more vulnerable to the very patterns of isolation and severance we have meticulously explored. To embrace interbeing is, thus, to accept an ethical imperative, a profound responsibility not only for our own well-being, but for the relational integrity of the whole. It demands a shift from a transactional paradigm of engagement, where relationships are viewed as instruments for personal gain or protection, to a transformative one, where relationality itself is understood as the primary medium through which meaning, purpose, and genuine freedom are co-created. This requires a re-evaluation of fundamental societal values, moving away from metrics of individual achievement and competitive advantage towards those that prioritize collective well-being, ecological stewardship, and the robust health of our relational commons. However, the path to architecting a relational society is fraught with formidable challenges, a veritable labyrinth of collective resistance mirroring the individual patterns of severance. The deep-seated cultural inertia of hyper-individualism presents a significant barrier. Our societal narratives, propagated through media, economic systems, and political discourse, consistently reinforce the myth of the self-made individual, the solitary hero, or the isolated innovator. This pervasive storytelling subtly yet powerfully shapes our perceptions of success, autonomy, and even happiness, often inadvertently valorizing detachment and self-reliance at the expense of mutual support and communal embeddedness. To challenge these narratives requires a conscious, sustained effort to cultivate alternative stories, tales of collaboration, interdependence, and resilience forged through connection that resonate with our innate human need for belonging. Furthermore, just as individuals who sever ties often grapple with a profound fear of vulnerability or a perceived loss of autonomy, so too does the collective harbour similar anxieties. The notion of interbeing, with its inherent demand for mutual responsibility and shared destiny, can trigger a collective fear of losing individual identity or being subsumed by the group. This fear is often exploited by divisive rhetoric that thrives on othering mechanisms, constructing artificial boundaries between groups and fostering an environment of mistrust and suspicion. When we perceive others as fundamentally separate, or even as threats, the collective tendency towards severance, manifesting as social stratification, political polarization, or even armed conflict, becomes an increasingly probable outcome. Dismantling these othering narratives and cultivating a shared sense of humanity requires an unwavering commitment to empathy, dialogue, and the courageous embrace of our shared vulnerabilities. Beyond cultural inertia and collective fear, systemic barriers also inadvertently promote fragmentation. Economic systems that reward cutthroat competition over collaborative innovation, educational institutions that prioritize individual performance over relational competency, and political structures that incentivize partisan division rather than consensus building, all contribute to an environment where interdependence is often perceived as a weakness rather than a strength. The erosion of robust community infrastructure, the increasing isolation facilitated by certain digital platforms, and the widening chasm of socioeconomic inequality further exacerbate these challenges, creating conditions ripe for both individual and collective severance. Addressing these systemic issues demands not merely superficial reforms, but a fundamental paradigm shift in how we design our institutions and allocate our resources, ensuring that they actively foster, rather than inhibit, genuine connection. Given these formidable obstacles, how then do we begin to architect a relational society to translate the aspirational vision of interbeing into tangible lived reality? The answer, we contend, lies in a multi-pronged, iterative approach that fundamentally reprioritizes relational health at every level of human organization. Education, we maintain, must serve as the cornerstone of this transformation. Beyond merely integrating relational literacy into curricula, we advocate for a complete relational pedagogy that permeates every aspect of learning from early childhood through adulthood. This involves not just teaching about empathy, communication, and conflict resolution, but actively cultivating these capacities through experiential learning, collaborative projects, and restorative practices embedded within educational institutions. Children must learn through direct experience that their well-being is intertwined with that of their peers, that constructive conflict resolution is a skill to be honed, and that vulnerability, when met with compassion, is a source of strength, not weakness. Furthermore, we must reimagine and rebuild our community infrastructure to actively foster connection. This entails designing public spaces that encourage interaction and shared experience rather than isolation. It requires the implementation of policies that support shared care responsibilities, such as comprehensive parental leave and robust elder care programs, recognizing that the health of families is foundational to the health of communities. Restorative justice models, which prioritize repair and reintegration over punishment, must be expanded within our legal and educational systems, offering pathways for healing relational breaches rather than simply severing ties. Critically, we must also demand and develop digital platforms that are intentionally designed to facilitate genuine connection, meaningful dialogue, and collaborative action, rather than those that algorithmically amplify division and reinforce echo chambers. A profound shift in our economic paradigms is also indispensable. Moving away from a relentless focus on competitive accumulation towards models that prioritize collaboration, circularity, and the equitable distribution of resources will inherently foster a sense of shared destiny. Valuing relational wealth, the strength of our social ties, the health of our communities, and the well-being of our planet, alongside traditional financial metrics, can reorient our collective endeavors towards more sustainable and interconnected forms of prosperity. Finally, leadership and governance must embody and champion the principles of interbeing. Leaders, whether in politics, business, or community organizations, have a profound responsibility to model ethical relationality, prioritize collective well-being, and actively bridge divides. This requires a shift from adversarial politics to collaborative governance, from short-term gains to long-term relational sustainability. The media, too, bears an immense responsibility to shift its narrative focus, moving beyond sensationalism and conflict to highlight stories of successful collaboration, community resilience, and the transformative power of human connection. The transformative power of this vision, we assert, lies in the recognition of collective choice. This is not a passive process of waiting for an inevitable future, but an active, iterative, and conscious endeavor that demands courage, vigilance, and sustained commitment from every individual and institution. The journey from fragmentation to flourishing, from severance to interbeing, is not a linear progression, but a dynamic dance, marked by inevitable setbacks and renewed efforts. Yet each conscious choice to lean into connection, to practice empathy, to engage in repair sends ripples of positive change throughout the collective. The individual healing journey, which we have meticulously outlined, thus becomes a microcosm and a catalyst for this larger societal transformation. As individuals reclaim their capacity for secure attachment, authentic communication, and compassionate engagement, they contribute to a growing collective capacity for the same. In conclusion, the choice before us, both individually and collectively, is stark yet profoundly empowering. To continue down the path of fragmentation, isolation, and eventual spiritual emptiness, or to courageously embrace the intricate, beautiful, and sometimes challenging tapestry of interbeing. The lessons gleaned from understanding the psychology of those who cut everyone off serve not as a condemnation, but as a potent diagnostic tool, illuminating the deep-seated relational maladies that afflict our societies. By understanding the roots of individual severance, we gain invaluable insights into the pathways for collective healing. Our vision culminates in a future where radical relational severance becomes an anomalous echo of a bygone era, replaced by a robust and resilient relational ecology. In this future, interdependence is not merely tolerated but celebrated as the wellspring of strength, meaning, and joy. It is a future where ethical relationality, the continuous practice of repair, and the unwavering pursuit of collective flourishing are not lofty ideals, but the foundational pillars of our shared humanity. We are, inextricably, part of one another. To deny this truth is to deny ourselves. To embrace it is to step into the fullness of our shared potential, to choose connection over fragmentation, healing over alienation, and the boundless richness of interbeing over the barren landscape of isolated survival. The time for this profound choice is now,